A homeless mother left her baby in front of a mansion and vanished. Years later, the mansion's owner discovered who the child was, and the connection left him in tears. The night descended on the Majestic like a cloak of shadows and storm. The clouds, dense and dark, covered the sky as rain fell in thick sheets, blurring the outlines of buildings and streets. Among flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated the city with ghostly glows, a female figure moved forward with an unsure step. It was Amelia, drenched to the bone, her face marked by both anguish and determination. The sound of her footsteps, muffled by the splashing water, blended with the muffled cries of Stella, her little daughter, trembling in her arms. Amelia paused under the flickering light of a street lamp that blinked, a temporary refuge amid the tempest. Her large, dark eyes reflected the desperation of a mother who had reached the limits of her strength. The rain struck her face violently, merging with the tears that streamed down her cheeks. Her conscience screamed in her mind, asking if she could really go through with her decision, but the answer lay in the innocent and frightened eyes of Stella. "It's all I have," she whispered, kissing her daughter's damp forehead. Amelia pulled out a crumpled, water-stained piece of paper from her pocket. On it, in shaky, rushed handwriting, was a simple message. "Please, take care of her. She's all I have." With a broken heart, she tucked the note into the blanket that wrapped around Stella and walked up to the imposing door of the Armstrong mansion. The mansion rose majestically, with its Gothic towers and windows that, from the outside, seemed to coldly stare at the world. Amelia knocked on the door, 3 quick and firm raps, before stepping back a few paces and vanishing into the night, her figure dissolving in the rain. Each drop that fell on her took away a piece of her resistance and hope. Inside the house, the stillness was interrupted by the sound of knocks on the door. Nora, the housekeeper, was in the living room collecting glasses and plates from a solitary evening with Blake. Evenings were always like this, silent, punctuated only by the whisper of the fire and the occasional creak of wood under the rain. When she heard the noise, Nora jumped, dropping a spoon to the floor, which rang with a sharp clink. Frowning, she made her way to the hallway, the echo of her steps resonating on the polished marble. Upon opening the door, the sight of little Stella, soaked and trembling, caused a knot of surprise and compassion to form in Nora's throat. The cold night air entered like a chilling breath, but Nora only saw the girl, her red cheeks and eyes wide like 2 stars in the night. Blake, irritated by the interruption, descended from his office, his steps deliberate and his gaze as cold as the marble columns. "What's going on, Nora?" he asked, his voice a contained whisper that carried the authority of a man used to controlling every aspect of his life. Nora, aware of the tension emanating from Blake, lifted her gaze, holding the child in her arms. The silence in the room became almost tangible, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the windows. "I found her at the door, sir. She has this." Nora extended the note with her trembling hand. Blake took it and read the words with his brow furrowed. For a moment, something indecipherable crossed his eyes when they met the girl's gaze. A spark of vulnerability that Nora noticed, and although fleeting, was enough to plant a seed of hope in her heart. But, as if that emotion were a betrayal, Blake turned away, his jaw tight. "Just for tonight," he decided, turning on his heel and disappearing down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the shadows. Nora, holding Stella more tightly, felt a mix of relief and fear. She knew that tonight was only the beginning, that what had started under the storm would not be easy to stop. She stroked the girl's head, whispering words of comfort that mingled with the sad song of rain hitting the windows. And so, as the storm battered the Majestic, Blake's mansion, once a sanctuary of solitude and power, became the stage for an inevitable change. Outside, Amelia's silhouette disappeared into the distance, carrying with it the promise to return, to fight, even though fate had forced her to sacrifice what she loved most. The dawn arrived at the Majestic like a cold sigh after the storm, with the streets still damp and the sky a leaden grey. In the Armstrong mansion, the stillness of the morning was only interrupted by the faint whimpers of Stella, waking up in the warmth of the blankets in the makeshift crib Nora had placed in the servants' room. The housekeeper, with a severe face and hands shaped by years of work, looked at her with a tenderness rarely allowed to surface. Stella, with her big, bright eyes, met her gaze with a curious blink. In the distance, Blake began his day as usual. He dressed in his spacious closet, surrounded by perfectly aligned suits and watches, marking every minute of his unyielding agenda. His mind focused on the business challenges awaiting him. However, a lingering discomfort pulsed within him since the night before. The note he had read still weighed in his pocket like an anchor. Nora interrupted his thoughts when she entered, her head bowed with calculated deference. "Sir, the girl needs food," she said, avoiding Blake's eyes, but noticing how his expression hardened. Blake dropped his gaze, his jaw tightening, and a heavy silence filled the room. After a few seconds, a contained sigh escaped his lips. "Do what's necessary, Nora. This changes nothing." "Only for now," he replied without looking at her, as if by not doing so he could avoid seeing the reflection of his own doubts. While Nora tended to Stella, the memories Blake had buried began to filter into his mind. Nights with Leonor, when they talked under the stars about the children they would one day have, intertwined with the sound of his wife's laughter, a lost melody that the child unknowingly awakened. The thoughts made him frown. He didn't want to give in to that fragility. He didn't want to open doors to the pain he had worked so hard to bury. In a different part of the city, the shelter where Amelia had hidden woke up with the bustle of other lost souls. She, curled up in a corner, her clothes still wet from the storm, trembled not only from the cold, but from the absence of her daughter. Every time she closed her eyes, the vision of Stella in the rain assaulted her, and the tears she tried to hold back threatened to overflow. A kind-faced woman approached with a cup of hot tea. "Drink it. It'll do you good," she said softly. It was Ivy, a social worker who did more than her shift required. Her eyes, a reflection of unyielding determination, fixed on Amelia, noticing her vulnerable state. "Thank you," Amelia whispered, holding the cup with trembling hands. The warm liquid traveled down her throat, and although it didn't calm the storm in her chest, it at least allowed her to feel a hint of human warmth amid her loneliness. Meanwhile, in the Armstrong and Sia offices, Cyrus watched Blake from the shadow of the meeting room. Blake's expression was tense, distracted, and this confirmed Cyrus's suspicions. Something had changed. Cyrus, with his calculated smile and keen gaze, decided he needed to act before the situation slipped out of his control. If Blake's vulnerability became obvious, he would know how to exploit it. Power was a game he had always been willing to play, and now a golden opportunity was coming his way. At the mansion, Nora watched Stella fall asleep, lulled by the whisper of a song she had heard from Leonor's lips years ago. The nostalgia and weight of the moment made her close her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to be carried away by the image of Leonor with her radiant smile, talking about unfulfilled dreams. Nora knew that the story had only just begun, and that what was to come would test not only Blake, but everyone who had ever shared his life. The girl, unaware of the drama now revolving around her, slept peacefully. But the calm in the mansion was only a prelude, a whisper before the storm of emotions, truths, and betrayals that would soon pull them all into a whirlwind from which no one would emerge unscathed. The nights at the Armstrong mansion had become different since Stella's arrival. What was once a refuge of solitude and stillness had transformed into a place where the echoes of the past and present intertwined. The dark hallways, witnesses to Blake's meticulous life, were now filled with a new sound, the cries of a child crying for attention. That first night, Stella's crying echoed throughout the house, breaking the cold serenity that had taken so much effort to maintain. Blake, in his study, tried to concentrate on the financial reports piled up on his desk. The presence of the child in his home, no matter how small, felt like a crack in the fortress he had built around his heart. The sound of Stella made him remember nights gone by when Leonor sweetly spoke of the children they dreamed of having. The laughter and promises of those days became distant, almost painful echoes that now disarmed him. He abruptly got up and crossed the room, watching the rain tap against the large windows. Frustration overwhelmed him, but it wasn't the anger he knew. It was a mix of helplessness and something he didn't dare name. Finally, the sobs stopped, and the mansion returned to silence. Blake exhaled through clenched teeth, wondering how many more nights he could endure. In the servants' room, Nora rocked Stella, who, after the crying, had fallen asleep with her cheeks still damp. Nora hummed a song she had learned from Leonor, a lullaby that spoke of stars and hope. She looked at the child and felt a mix of tenderness and concern. She knew Blake's heart was like a closed door, but she also knew the power that a tiny spark had to open it. Stella's eyes, so full of innocence, had already done what no one else could, planted a seed of doubt in him. Far from the mansion, in a dark corner of the city, Amelia walked through the damp alleys, the makeshift shelter where she had been offered no protection from Oliver's watchful gaze and his men. She knew her life was in danger, but the anguish for Stella overshadowed any fear. The image of the little girl, her large eyes wide in the storm, was a constant hammering in her mind. She couldn't give up. She had to find a way to protect her and, one day, get her back. In the Armstrong and Sear meeting room, Cyrus observed the faces of the board members. The atmosphere was heavy with tension. His always cared-for hands played with a pen as he smiled coldly. He knew Blake was weakening, and that excited him. His opportunity to advance, to take control, was becoming more palpable. With calculated moves, he began to whisper insinuations about the suspicious adoption of a child, planting the first seeds of doubt among his colleagues. Blake, unaware of Cyrus's moves, was lost in his own thoughts when night fell. The candles flickered in his study, and the papers he reviewed no longer held his attention. The small object he had found among Stella's belongings, an embroidered piece of clothing with initials that seemed unnervingly familiar, kept him absorbed. That garment, a simple remnant, sparked memories he struggled to forget. A promise made to Leonor, and a wish that never came true. Fatigue and doubt led him to the room where Nora was taking care of Stella. Seeing her asleep, an impulse stopped him at the threshold. He said nothing, but his eyes betrayed him. Nora, with an understanding gaze, remained silent, allowing him that moment of vulnerability that only the dim light of night could protect. The mansion, still wrapped in the silence of the night, began to change, as if responding to the slow and painful heartbeat that Blake was beginning to feel in his chest. Thus, amidst the noise and silence, Blake's life wavered between the past he had avoided and an uncertain future that was being forged, driven by the eyes of a child who unknowingly had started to awaken a dormant heart. Dawn brought with it a thick fog that enveloped the city of the majestic like a veil of mystery. In the Armstrong mansion, the shy rays of the sun tried to penetrate the thick curtains of the windows, but their light only served to accentuate the shadows that resided in Blake's heart. Stella's presence had turned the nights into a constant struggle between reason and a feeling he still refused to accept. However, the morning arrived relentlessly, dragging him back to the company duties and the tangle of commitments that kept him away from his own emotions. In the Armstrong and Sear meeting room, Cyrus moved among the executives with a calculated smile and an attitude that oscillated between friendliness and intrigue. He knew that Stella's recent appearance in Blake's life had shaken him, and that weakness was a crack he planned to widen until it destroyed him. With a fleeting glance at his colleagues, he let out a veiled comment that captured everyone's attention. "I've heard some curious rumors about our dear Blake's mansion. An unexpected visit, they say." Murmurs began to circulate, and knowing glances were exchanged in silence. Blake, unaware of the shadows moving around him, was in his study reviewing financial reports. searching for inconsistencies that somehow resonated with the unease he had felt since the arrival of the child. The numbers, which once spoke to him with the clarity of a language he mastered, now seemed strangely opaque. Without realizing it, his mind wandered to Stella, to how her big, bright eyes looked at him with a trust that was as painful as it was revitalizing. Nora, a keen observer, had noticed how Blake spent more time lingering near Stella's room without speaking, as if searching for something yet fearing to find it. That night, as she covered the little girl, she whispered, "Your presence here has moved more than just walls, little one. You've touched a soul we thought lost." Elsewhere in the city, in the small apartment Ivy had turned into a refuge for the most vulnerable victims, Amelia began to regain her strength. Yet, fear never left her. She felt the threat of Oliver and his men with every sound she heard outside. Gabe, the idealistic young lawyer, arrived with new news. "I found something," he said, dropping a file on the table. "There's evidence that Cyrus is moving funds suspiciously. He's linked to Oliver and the fraud that destroyed your life." Ivy and Amelia exchanged glances, both hope and fear reflected in their eyes. The fight they were beginning wasn't just for the truth, but for survival itself. Meanwhile, Nick, the opportunistic journalist, walked through the bustling city center. He had heard the rumors about the adoption in Blake's mansion and saw a golden opportunity to uncover a scandal. However, as he investigated deeper, he began stumbling upon details that didn't align with the image the yellow press wanted to paint. The first clues led him to unexpected places where stories of corruption and betrayal started blending with the faces of those who had been silenced. Back at the mansion, Blake could not ignore the feeling that something bigger was brewing. Nora, sensing the tension in him, spoke with the confidence of someone who had seen too much. "Sometimes, the answer you're looking for isn't in the papers, but in the eyes of those you think have nothing to say," she hinted, referring to Stella. Cyrus, for his part, had set his plan into motion with precision. The insinuations had turned into whispered comments and eventually into open questions during the meeting. The atmosphere in the company had become thick, filled with uncertainty and suspicious glances. Blake's figure, which had always been synonymous with power and control, began to waver, and Cyrus knew it. Blake ended his day with a feeling he couldn't decipher. When he returned to the mansion, Stella's eyes met his, and something inside him that had been dormant for too long took a step to the surface. But before he could allow himself to explore that emotion, reality returned with the force of a storm, a whisper of betrayal stirring in the hallways of his company, and a past beginning to rise, ready to collect its debt. Dawn arrived with a grayish light that filled the Armstrong mansion, casting its cold glow over the rooms and hallways that had once resonated with the shared laughter and dreams of Blake and Leonor. Nora, as every day, began her routine by checking the rooms and making sure Stella was comfortable. The little girl, unaware of the complexity of her situation, woke up with a smile that lit up the darkest corners of the house. As Nora tucked her in and hummed an old song, she noticed the change in the air, a mix of tension and hope, a premonition of what was to come. Blake, on the other hand, had spent the night awake. The unease that had accompanied him since Stella's arrival had begun to transform into something deeper, a need to find answers. Looking out the window of his study, he watched as the city woke up to the rapid pace of traffic and the first lights of the storefronts. Yet, his mind was still trapped in memories of Leonor, of the nights they spent talking about a future that never came. A flash of those memories sparked when his fingers found the letter Nora had given him, a letter Leonor had left before she died, and which until that moment he had not had the courage to read. The letter was carefully folded, the paper yellowed and fragile to the touch, like an echo of a lost time. With his heart in his throat, Blake opened it and began to read the words his beloved wife had written with a warmth and love that transcended time. "My dear Blake, if you are reading this, I know that life has taken us down paths we never imagined. I want you to remember that the love we shared is greater than any ambition or achievement. If the chance ever comes for you to feel again, to give and receive love, I beg you not to close your heart. I always dreamed of seeing the house filled with laughter and joy, with children who would remind us that life, though brief, is beautiful in its fragility. Promise me that you won't let the darkness defeat you. Take care of the light, even if it comes in a way you didn't expect. With all my love, Leonor. The last lines faded into a blurry mess of ink and tears. Blake didn't realize how much time had passed until a wet feeling on his cheeks made him blink. A lump formed in his throat, forcing him to take a deep breath. Leonor's letter was not just a testament of love, but a challenge, a plea for him not to let death be the only ending they shared. There was a soft knock on the door, and Nora entered with the same cautious expression she always wore when she sensed that Blake was at his most vulnerable. Without saying a word, she placed a tray of coffee and noticed the letter in Blake's hands. She knew him well enough to understand that a crucial moment had arrived. "Sir, Stella is awake. She seemed to be waiting to see you," Nora whispered, her voice filled with a soft, encouraging tone. Blake looked up, and for a moment their eyes met, sharing a silent understanding. Without replying, he stood up and walked toward the room where the child was. Nora watched him go, a mix of relief and hope in her eyes. Blake stopped at the threshold of the door. Stella looked up at him from her crib, her eyes filled with curiosity and the brightness that only children have. A strange warmth, almost forgotten, spread across his chest. Not knowing exactly why, he approached and lifted her into his arms. The light weight of the little girl and the warmth of her small body made him close his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to remember Leonor's words. "Take care of the light, even if it comes in a way you didn't expect." While Blake processed the letter and Stella's presence in the offices of Armstrong and Sear, Cyrus moved with the impatience of a predator, sensing the proximity of his prey. News of the child's presence in the mansion had started circulating within the company, and the rumors spread like wildfire. Cyrus, who had manipulated and planted each of these seeds, knew that the next step was to bring everything to light. He wasn't just seeking to discredit Blake. He was looking to exploit any weakness that would make him relinquish power. That same day, Gabe arrived at Ivy's house with a folder of documents under his arm. "I've gathered enough evidence to show the links between Cyrus and Oliver. But this is bigger than we thought. Cyrus is moving funds and has connections with high-ranking officials. If we expose this, there will be retaliation," he said, letting the gravity of his words fill the room. Amelia, pale and worn, but more determined than ever, listened from her corner, her hands clenched in a gesture of resistance. The hope of getting Stella back and unraveling the web of corruption that had ruined her life was the only thing keeping her on her feet. Elsewhere in the city, Nick sat in his small makeshift office, reviewing recordings and notes he had accumulated over the weeks. What had started as a scandal story about the illegal adoption of a child was turning into something much more complicated. The connections between Cyrus, Oliver, and the shady financial dealings at Blake's company led him to understand that the story he was about to tell was much more powerful than he had imagined. The journalistic ethics he had always considered secondary now weighed heavily on his conscience. Back at the mansion, Blake sat by the window with Stella in his arms. The wind shook the branches of the trees, and the leaves fell with a soft whisper. The little girl looked at him and laughed unexpectedly, a clear laugh that seemed to fill every corner of the room. For the first time in years, Blake allowed a smile, small but sincere, to appear on his lips. He felt the weight of the promise he had made to Leonor, and understood that the time had come to act, not only for Stella, but for the memory of the woman he had once loved more than anything in the world. Nora, watching the scene from the half-open door, let out a sigh of relief. The house, which had been a mausoleum of memories and pain, was beginning to change. However, danger loomed, and she knew it. Cyrus wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and the footsteps she heard at the end of the hallway were only the beginning of a storm that would soon reach them all. The atmosphere in the Majestic became denser with each passing dawn. The news of Blake's adoption of a child had ceased to be a buried rumor in the Armstrong and Sear board meetings and had become a topic that stirred conversations and sowed doubts. Curious glances and hushed conversations became a constant in the hallways, and Cyrus, with a barely concealed satisfaction, walked among the employees like a man who had planted the seed of his victory. Blake, in the solitude of his study, felt the weight of the tension. Recent meetings at the company had been marked by subtle questions, revealing a growing distrust in his leadership. The letter from Leonor, which he kept locked away in a drawer, was a constant reminder that he needed to protect Stella and honor the dreams he had once shared with his wife. But the pressure to maintain his position and face the suspicions was beginning to take its toll. Nora, who sensed the growing storm in Blake's life, stayed close to Stella and watched him with the concerned look of someone who knows that the pain of an unresolved past can be as destructive as the most tangible threat. The bond between Blake and the child had been slowly forged. Although he still tried to maintain some distance, every gesture of Stella, every laugh or glance, pulled him closer to the emotional abyss he had feared since Leonor's death. That morning, as Blake reviewed a series of documents looking for inconsistencies, a note arrived from the board calling for an emergency meeting. Cyrus had taken the next step. The suspicions he had fed had turned into formal accusations, and now he sought to force Blake to explain Stella's situation. The pressure was immense, but Blake knew he couldn't show weakness. If Cyrus managed to do so, his position, not only as president of the company, but as a man of influence, would be at risk. Elsewhere in the city, Gabe, with Ivy's help, was making progress in the investigation that had kept them on edge. They had found evidence linking Cyrus to a network of embezzlement and corrupt practices that extended beyond the company. The financial documents and witnesses who had begun to cooperate confirmed that Cyrus and Oliver were more than just allies. They were key pieces of a corruption scheme that touched high-profile figures in the Majestic. Amelia, although weakened by lack of rest and the effects of constant fear, continued to fight to stay on her feet. The shelter Ivy had placed her in had become a small bastion of resistance. She knew that each day without news of Stella was torture, but she also understood that she couldn't get closer to the mansion without risking everything. Oliver's threats were as real as the pain that kept her awake at night. Gabe, with a worried expression, entered the refuge with a folder that seemed heavier than any other. "We have enough to link Cyrus to Oliver and his movements abroad," he said, looking at Amelia with a mix of urgency and hope. "But if we make this public, the repercussions could be devastating. We need more protection and someone inside the company willing to testify." The determination in Amelia's eyes flared. "Do it, Gabe. We don't have time," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice revealed that she knew the risk involved. In the mansion, Stella was playing with a worn-out doll, an improvised gift from Nora. Blake, who had arrived early from the company after the board meeting summons, watched the little girl from the doorway, battling the mix of love and fear she stirred in him. His thoughts were interrupted when Nora approached with a worried expression. "Cyrus won't stop, sir. I've heard what they're saying in the market, what the employees are whispering. If you don't do something soon, he'll get away with it," Nora warned. Blake nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her words. He knew that Cyrus was dangerous and wouldn't stop until he took what he believed was his by right. As night fell, Nick, the journalist who had been investigating Blake's story, found himself at a crossroads. The evidence he had gathered so far placed him in a delicate position. What initially seemed like a simple case of suspicious adoption had revealed itself as a much darker web of corruption. He knew that exposing Cyrus and Oliver was a task that required not only courage, but allies willing to risk everything. He remembered Ivy's name and her connections to the victims of corruption. Determined, Nick prepared for a visit to the refuge where he knew he would find more answers. That very night, Blake summoned Nora to his study. The room, illuminated only by the fire in the hearth, seemed darker than ever. "There's something I need you to know," he began, his voice lower and more vulnerable than usual. "Leonor left me a letter. She knew there would come a moment when I'd have to choose between the life we built and the life she always wanted for me. This child, Stella, is more than a twist of fate. She's a second chance, and I can't fail." Nora, moved, nodded with unshed tears in her eyes. She knew Leonor's words had always been a guiding light for Blake, and seeing that he had finally found the courage to face what they meant filled her with both fear and hope. Cyrus, for his part, received a report in his private office. It was a dossier confirming what he already suspected. Gabe, Ivy, and now Nick were on his trail. His smile vanished as he realized the magnitude of the danger. If these documents came to light, he wouldn't just lose his chance to dethrone Blake, but would face charges that could destroy him. He knew he had to act quickly and decisively. He gave precise instructions to his men, preparing to make his final move with a coldness that admitted no mistakes. The city, wrapped in an expectant silence, awaited the outcome of a game of power and betrayal. Meanwhile, Amelia, from her hiding place, prayed for Stella's safety, unaware that the battle for truth and justice had already begun, and that the price of that truth would test everyone involved. The city of the Majestic seemed to hold its breath as a cloud of tension enveloped every corner. The news of Stella's adoption had stopped being just a rumor. It had become the epicenter of a media storm that threatened to sweep everything in its path. In the offices of Armstrong and Sear, the executives, who had once been silent allies of Blake, now wavered. Whispers in the hallways, late-night calls, and closed-door meetings had become the norm. The sense that something inevitable was about to happen hung in the air, dense and suffocating. Blake sat in his study, his gaze fixed on an undefined point on the wall. Leonor's letter and Nora's words from the night before echoed in his mind. He felt that every step he took brought him closer to the abyss, but he couldn't allow Cyrus, a man whose only principle was ambition, to destroy everything left of his life and Leonor's memory. The sound of the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Nora, her face bearing the mark of concern. "Sir, the board meeting has been moved up. Cyrus has insisted that the topic of the adoption and certain financial transactions, which he says need to be clarified, be addressed," she said in a restrained voice. Blake nodded. He knew he could delay the inevitable no longer. "Let it be done, Nora. Today is the day," he replied, adjusting his tie with a gesture meant to appear more confident than he truly felt. As Blake prepared for the meeting, Ivy and Gabe worked frantically in their makeshift office at a small cafe downtown. The noise of traffic and the surrounding conversations seemed non-existent to them. The documents Gabe had obtained and the statements from protected witnesses revealed a web of corruption and fraud that extended far beyond the company. "Cyrus hasn't just manipulated the money, he's played with the lives of many people like Amelia," Gabe said, his fingers nervously drumming on the table. Ivy nodded, her gaze resolute. "We need Nick. He's the one who can give this the platform it needs to reach the public before Cyrus tries to silence everything." At that moment, Nick entered, his tall, gangly figure casting shadows under the dim light of the cafe. He had spent the last 48 hours without sleep, reviewing recordings and cross-referencing data. "I have what you need, but this is going to be more dangerous than we thought," he said, throwing a couple of folders on the table. "If we do this, we're risking everything." Meanwhile, in the mansion, Stella ran down the hallway, laughing as she chased the sunlight filtering through the curtains. Nora watched her with a melancholic smile, knowing that this brief moment of innocence was the refuge both she and Blake needed. But the sound of the phone made her startle. It was a call from Gabe. "Nora, we need him this afternoon. The evidence we've gathered is enough to confront Cyrus, but Blake has to be aware of every detail. Today will be a decisive day, he said urgently. Hours later, in the Armstrong and Sear boardroom, all eyes were on Blake. The atmosphere was tense, almost claustrophobic. Cyrus, with a smile that barely concealed his satisfaction, stood to speak. "Colleagues, it is our duty to protect the future of this company. The recent actions of our president have raised a series of questions that deserve clear and honest answers," he said, his voice resonating with a false gravity that made those closest to him nod in approval. Blake looked at Cyrus with the calm of someone who had decided to fight to the end. "It's true. There are questions that I will answer. But first, I'll present something that you all need to know," he said firmly, as he handed a folder to each board member. Inside were the pieces of evidence Gabe and Ivy had collected: bank transfers, falsified contracts, and testimonies from employees revealing the corruption network led by Cyrus and Oliver. The silence that followed was like a blade hanging in the air. The faces, once sure and confident, turned pale. Cyrus, for the first time, lost his composure. His hands trembled as he reviewed the documents, trying to find a gap, an escape. This is a setup," he stammered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. Suddenly, the door opened, and Nick entered, accompanied by Ivy and Gabe. The shock of the board members was total. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Nick, an independent journalist, and I've been investigating this network for months. What you have in front of you is just the beginning. If you want to protect this company and its reputation, you must know that the truth can no longer be hidden," he said, his voice clear and firm. Blake, not taking his eyes off Cyrus, added, "What I've done, what has led me to care for Stella, was an act of humanity. What Cyrus has done is an act of betrayal." Cyrus, cornered and with no way out, tried to stand, but the security guards, previously alerted, restrained him. The murmurs turned into a deafening buzz. The decisions and alliances that had been kept in secret were coming to light, and the board had no choice but to accept the reality. As all of this unfolded, in the refuge where Amelia was staying, a call from Ivy alerted her to what had happened. Her eyes filled with tears upon hearing that the truth she had fought for was starting to come to light. But fear still lingered. She knew Oliver wouldn't stand idly by. That night in the mansion, Blake returned tired, but with a peace he hadn't felt in years. He found Stella asleep in Nora's lap, and upon seeing her, something inside him broke and rebuilt at the same time. "Nora, everything has changed. But this is just the beginning," he said, stroking the girl's head. Nora nodded, aware that while they had taken a big step, the shadows still lurking were dangerous and wouldn't be easily defeated. In a dark office, Oliver received the news of Cyrus's fall. His eyes, filled with rage and calculated coldness, fixed on the phone. "The game's not over," he murmured, before making a call that would echo in the days to come, putting at risk everyone who had fought for the truth. Dawn over the Majestic arrived with a deceptive calm, as if the whole city were preparing to witness the conclusion of a long-anticipated drama. Cyrus's fall, though significant, had left everyone in the company and the city's residents waiting for the next moves. Blake woke early, his mind still shaken by the events of the previous day. He knew the battle wasn't over. Oliver, the true mastermind behind the corruption network, was still moving in the shadows, and the press, fueled by Cyrus's leaks, wouldn't be long in demanding answers. The mansion, which in the past weeks had been a refuge of doubts and remorse, now resonated with the unease of what was to come. Nora, ever watchful, watched Stella play in the garden, the child unaware of the whirlwind of events swirling around her. Nora noticed Blake standing by the window, his expression a mixture of determination and exhaustion. "Sir, the press is already outside. There are reporters and cameras stationed at the gate. The news from the board has leaked, and they want to hear your side," Nora said, breaking the silence that seemed to envelop the room. Blake nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Stella's figure. "Today, I have to tell them the truth. Not just for me, but for her. for what she means to this place, and for what Leonor always wanted, he replied, his voice laden with emotion. A few blocks from the mansion, Nick prepared to attend the press conference Blake had called. He knew his involvement, along with the evidence he had gathered, would be crucial to expose the magnitude of Cyrus and Oliver's crimes. Ivy and Gabe found him in front of the building where he had worked as an investigative journalist, and the three exchanged looks filled with determination and nervousness. "Are you sure this is the right thing, Nick?" Ivy asked, her voice barely a whisper. Nick, who in past times would have hesitated for fear of the consequences, nodded firmly. "This isn't just for the story. It's for the people who have been silenced and for those who still have no voice. Today, everything will change." Meanwhile, in a study darkened by closed curtains, Oliver received the latest news about the situation. Cyrus's fall had been an unexpected blow, but he knew he still had tools to manipulate the board. "Make sure the journalist and his allies don't leave there without a lesson," he said, letting his threat hang in the air before hanging up. His contacts in high places and the influence he wielded were his safety net, and he had no qualms about using them. The press conference took place in the main hall of Armstrong and Sear, a space adorned with marble columns and a high ceiling that amplified every sound. Journalists filled the room, cameras ready, and questions prepared to fly like daggers. Blake, with Leonor's letter still tucked in his jacket's inner pocket, stood behind the podium, accompanied by Nick, Ivy, and Gabe. Nora, from a corner of the room, watched the scene with her heart in her throat. The murmur of the room stopped when Blake began to speak. "Today, before all of you, I want to tell the truth. Not just the truth of why Stella came into my life, but the truth of the shadows that have tried to destroy this company and the lives of many people in this city," he said, his voice resonating with a mixture of solemnity and strength. Blake explained how Stella had been left at the door of his mansion, how he had hesitated to accept her, and how Leonor's words, written in the letter, had pushed him to protect the child. "Leonor always wanted me to find a way to love again, to care for the light in the darkest places," he added, pulling out the letter and reading it quietly. The room fell into a deep silence, and several journalists, used to stories of scandal and corruption, felt the human truth behind these events strike them in an unexpected way. Nick took the microphone and presented the evidence that he and Gabe had gathered: bank records, emails, and testimonies implicating Cyrus and Oliver in the corruption network. Images of the documents appeared on a screen behind them, and a murmur of surprise and indignation swept through the room. The evidence was irrefutable, and the narrative of betrayal and greed that had once been just a rumor now materialized before everyone's eyes. Suddenly, the sound of a vibrating phone interrupted the atmosphere. Gabe looked at the screen, and his face turned pale. "It's Amelia. She's in danger," he whispered to Ivy, who quickly understood the gravity of the situation. Oliver wasn't just going to stand by. His retaliation had begun. Blake, noticing the commotion between Ivy and Gabe, turned toward the audience. "Today is not only about clearing a name, but about protecting those who have been silenced by power and corruption. This company, this city, can no longer allow fear to dictate our future," he declared in a decisive tone. The flashes from cameras and the questions shouting in unison broke the silence. Nick, with a strong voice, added, "Today, we will publish all of this. There's no turning back." But before the conference could conclude, a man burst into the room with an envelope in hand. He was one of Oliver's contacts, a messenger who threw the envelope onto the podium and disappeared into the crowd before security could stop him. Blake picked up the envelope and opened it, revealing a photo of Amelia and a clear message: "She's next." The room descended into controlled chaos. The reality of the threat was tangible, and all those involved understood that the battle had only just begun. Blake looked at Nick, Ivy, and Gabe, and with a nod indicated that the plan must proceed. They knew Oliver had played his card, but they also knew that the commitment to protect Amelia and Stella, to face fear and corruption, was now a shared vow. In the mansion, Nora cared for Stella, still unaware of the magnitude of the events unfolding. Across the city, Amelia, trembling and surrounded by Ivy and Gabe, knew that the danger was no longer just a memory, but a threat that had returned. But this time, she wasn't alone. The morning after the press conference, the Majestic had turned into a hotbed of rumors and speculation. The headlines of newspapers and the screens of news outlets were filled with images of Blake standing at the podium, holding Leonor's letter and the corruption evidence he had revealed alongside Nick and Gabe. However, the anonymous message he received, the photo of Amelia accompanied by the sinister warning, "She's next," remained in the minds of all involved like an hourglass, reminding them that time and danger were closing in. Amelia, who was in a safe refuge, kept staring out the window, waiting to see a shadow, a sign that Oliver had sent someone for her. Ivy and Gabe stayed by her side, exchanging looks of concern and urgency. The decision to make everything they knew public had been right, but it had also put Amelia in the line of fire. "This can't go on like this, Gabe," Ivy said, her voice low and filled with determination. "We need to move Amelia to a safer place. If Oliver decides to act, not only will she be in danger, but Stella too." Gabe nodded, his hands clenched into fists as he mentally went over the options they had. In Blake's mansion, Nora had received news of the threat, and although her exterior remained calm, inside she felt a mixture of fear and protectiveness. Stella, who didn't understand what was happening, played with her dolls in the living room, lit by the sun streaming through the large windows. Blake, who had just arrived from the company after a night of calls and emergency meetings, watched the child from the doorway and felt that the life he was now trying to protect had become his reason for being. He couldn't allow Leonor's legacy and the promise he had made to fade under Oliver's shadow. Blake approached Nora and explained the situation in a low voice. "We're going to reinforce the security of the house, Nora. We can't take any risks. Stella is the weak point that Oliver would use without hesitation," he said, looking at the girl who smiled at him, unaware of the fear weaving around her. Nora nodded, her expression hardened by the responsibility weighing on her shoulders. "Sir, do what you have to do. Here, we'll protect her with our lives if necessary." Meanwhile, Nick was at the office of the independent newspaper he had started managing after deciding to distance himself from traditional media. The news of the press conference had caused a stir, and the phone lines were ringing non-stop with questions and veiled threats from powerful figures. He knew he had put his career at risk, but also that this was the story that would define him. He stepped away for a moment from the calls and messages to send an urgent email to a source in the local police, someone he trusted who could help protect Amelia and bring to light the crimes of Oliver. Ivy, on her part, seized the brief moment of calm to call Blake. "We need to act quickly. Amelia can't stay here any longer. If Oliver makes his move, we won't be able to protect her properly," she said, her voice firm with no room for objections. Blake understood the urgency in Ivy's words and took a moment to respond. "I'll prepare a safe space in the mansion. With the enhanced security, she'll be safe here with Stella," he proposed. The idea of bringing Amelia to the mansion was not without risks, but it was the best option. Ivy and Gabe made preparations to move her by nightfall, when the shadows could hide their movements. They knew it was only a matter of time before Oliver figured out where she was. The sun had set when a black car stopped in front of the refuge. Ivy and Gabe, along with a couple of trusted guards, escorted Amelia, who wore a headscarf and a trench coat that concealed her figure. The streets of the Majestic were empty at this hour, but every corner, every shadow, seemed to hide a threat. Upon reaching the mansion, Blake was waiting with Nora. Amelia, her heart racing, entered the house, and her eyes immediately met Stella's, who looked at her with a mixture of awe and recognition. The little girl ran to her mother, and Amelia embraced her with an intensity that made time stand still. Nora's eyes filled with tears, and Blake, watching from the other side of the room, felt a weight in his chest, a mixture of relief and guilt. He knew this reunion was shadowed by the threat that still loomed over them. That same night, while the city slept under a starry sky, Oliver met with his contacts. He knew that Blake and his allies had dealt a severe blow to his network, but he also knew that power was still on his side. "If Blake thinks a simple press conference can stop me, he's gravely mistaken," he said, his voice cold as a knife. He ordered his men to investigate every move Nick and Gabe made and to locate Amelia's new whereabouts. The battle for truth wasn't over yet, and Oliver was ready to play his last card. At the mansion, Blake gathered his allies in the main hall. "Tomorrow, Nick will publish the rest of the evidence. We need to be prepared for any reaction," he said, watching Amelia, who hadn't left Stella's side for a moment. Ivy, with a determined look, added, "The city needs to see that we won't back down. This is our chance to change the narrative and protect those who've suffered because of Oliver's ambition." Nick, who had just arrived after finishing his work in the newsroom, nodded. "What we publish tomorrow will be definitive, but we need to be ready. Oliver doesn't give up without a fight." Amelia, speaking for the first time in the meeting, with a low voice but full of resolve, said, "I've lost so much because of that man's greed. I won't let him take the only thing I have left." Her words, filled with pain and courage, resonated in everyone present. It was a reminder of why they were there, fighting. As the night advanced and the city of the Majestic remained calm, everyone in the mansion knew that the calm was just the prelude to the storm that was approaching. The truth was about to be fully revealed, and with it, the secrets that Oliver had kept buried for so long. The clock marked the hours, each second bringing them closer to dawn and an inevitable confrontation. Outside, the wind shook the branches of the trees, and the moon shone over the city like a watchful eye, witnessing the movements of those who, between shadows and light, were weaving a new fate. The light of dawn in the Majestic was more than just a simple prelude to a new day. It was a warning that something was about to change irrevocably. The streets were beginning to wake, but at the Armstrong mansion, no one had slept. The previous day had been filled with emotions, and the night had been a mix of planning and vigilance. Blake, Amelia, Ivy, Gabe, and Nick gathered early in the library, a space where the bookshelves and the crackling fire gave a false sense of security. Nick was reviewing the documents one last time that he would publish in a matter of hours. The evidence exposing Oliver's transactions, testimonies from affected employees, and falsified contracts were compelling. "Everything's ready," he said, looking up to meet the gazes of his companions. "Today, the Majestic will see Oliver's true face." Amelia, who had spent the night curled up next to Stella, felt a mix of fear and hope. She knew that publishing the truth would be a fatal blow to Oliver, but she also understood that it would make him even more dangerous. The threat of the photo still weighed over them. "We'll be safe here, right?" she asked, seeking confirmation in Blake's eyes. Blake, with a firm voice and a face hardened by determination, replied, "We've done everything we can to protect ourselves. Today, we don't back down, no matter what happens." Outside, the city was starting to hear about the revelation that Nick had published in his independent media. The first reactions were ones of astonishment. Journalists' phones at other outlets were ringing non-stop, seeking confirmation, a comment, or a statement. The evidence was so clear that even the most skeptical started to question their support for Oliver and his power network. In his luxurious office, Oliver received the news with a stone-faced expression. The report handed to him by a trembling assistant confirmed everything. The evidence he had tried to suppress was now in the hands of the public. For the first time in a long while, he felt the control slipping from his grasp. His calculating mind searched for a plan of containment, but the options were limited. "Gather all our contacts. We're not going down without a fight," he ordered, with a voice that chilled the blood. Meanwhile, at the mansion, an unexpected call interrupted the conversation in the library. It was a contact of Nick's in the police, someone who had been closely following the case. "You need to get out of there. There's movement on the streets, and it's not a coincidence," he warned in an urgent tone. The faces of everyone in the room tensed, and Blake knew that the confrontation was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. "Nora, take Stella and Amelia to the basement. They'll be safer there," he ordered. And Nora, with an expression that left no room for objections, nodded and took Stella's hand, guiding Amelia with a firmness that only a born protector could show. Ivy and Gabe moved quickly, securing the doors and windows, while Blake checked the security cameras around the property. Nick, aware that his presence was a risk to the others, began writing a farewell message for his team, instructing them on what to do if something happened to him. The silence of the morning was broken when footsteps and voices were heard outside the mansion. Men dressed in black, some familiar faces from Oliver's social circles, approached with determined movements. The group in the library prepared for what could be their last confrontation. Blake, with a firm gesture, took a phone and dialed a number he had kept for emergencies only. "Inspector Ramirez, it's now or never," he said. They had arranged with a police contact that, in case of escalation, they would intervene. However, he knew that time was a relentless enemy. The first knocks on the front door echoed like thunder. Amelia, who was holding Stella in the basement, closed her eyes and tried to calm her breathing. Nora, who stayed with them, murmured prayers softly, hoping the thick wall would protect them from whatever might happen upstairs. On the main floor, Blake and his allies prepared to confront the intruders. Oliver's men tried to force the door, but the sound of distant sirens stopped them. Nick's eyes lit up as he realized the police were approaching. Oliver, from a car parked at a safe distance, saw the red and blue lights reflected in the mansion's windows and knew he had lost this round. But his gaze, full of hatred and promises of vengeance, made it clear he wasn't going to retreat easily. The officers stormed into the mansion and arrested Oliver's men. The cameras of reporters who had followed the noise captured the scene from the street. The entire city was witnessing the fall of one of its most powerful men. Oliver, with his face covered in shadow and frustration, knew it was only a matter of time before his connections began to crumble. Once things calmed down, Blake descended to the basement. Amelia looked at him with tears in her eyes, and without a word, they embraced. It was a gesture that sealed the promise they had overcome the darkest night, and that, together, they could face whatever came next. In the following weeks, the investigation into Oliver and his corruption network took an irreversible turn. The allies who had supported him began to fall one by one, some testifying against him to reduce their own sentences. The city, once a stronghold of secrets and power, was shaken by the scandal. Nick, despite facing threats and criticism, established himself as a journalist who had sacrificed everything for the truth. His magazine became a symbol of integrity and justice, a light in the shadows that still persisted. Amelia and Stella found a home in Blake's mansion, a space where pain and loss could be transformed into something new and hopeful. Nora, who had witnessed both darkness and light, watched as the laughter of the little girl filled the hallways, bringing life back to the place. Blake, on his part, had gone from being a man haunted by his ghosts to one who had found a new reason to live. He knew the struggle wasn't over, but the love and promise he had made to Leonor had been fulfilled in a way he never imagined. Inspector Ramirez, who had responded to the emergency call and orchestrated the capture, visited Blake weeks later. "What you did here was brave. The city needs more of that," he said, shaking the businessman's hand. Blake, with a smile reflecting both exhaustion and gratitude, responded, "We did it for the voices that were never heard, and for those that are still to be raised." Justice had finally touched the Majestic, and though the wounds would take time to heal, the seeds of a new beginning had been planted, watered by sacrifice, courage, and the certainty that truth, though late, always finds its way. The echo of the scandal still resonated in the Majestic, a city that, after recent events, was beginning to redefine itself. The images of the press conference, the arrival of the police at Blake's mansion, and the capture of Oliver's men still graced the front pages of newspapers. The fall of such a powerful figure as Oliver had left a void that was being filled with rumors and hopes for genuine change. In the mansion, the atmosphere had changed. The tension and fear that had been constant companions for weeks now dissipated, leaving room for a different kind of silence, one of reflection and new beginnings. Amelia, after days of being unable to leave the safety of the house, finally felt safe. Stella played in the garden under Nora's watchful eye, her concerns softened into a serene smile. Every laugh of the little girl was a reminder that, despite everything, light could return to places that had once been immersed in darkness. Blake was in his study, reviewing the latest reports on the restructuring of Armstrong and Sear. The company had taken a significant media hit, but the measures he had taken, along with the evidence provided by Nick, Ivy, and Gabe, had helped clear his name and rebuild trust with employees and shareholders. However, he knew there were still challenges ahead. The roots of the corruption that Oliver had sown couldn't be uprooted overnight. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Amelia, wearing a simple dress and her hair tied up in a bun that highlighted the delicate firmness of her face. Blake gestured for her to come in, and she approached, her steps tentative yet determined. "I wanted to thank you," Amelia said, breaking the silence. "Not just for protecting me, but for protecting Stella. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you enough." Blake looked at her and felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in a long time. "You don't have to thank me. The truth is, protecting her saved me too," he admitted, his voice low but sincere. Leonor's words still resonated in his mind, and he understood that her legacy was bigger than a simple promise. It was a change that had transformed his life and the lives of everyone around him. At that moment, Nora appeared at the door, interrupting the conversation with a smile on her face. "There's someone at the entrance. Gabe and Ivy have come to see you," she said, nodding toward the hallway. Blake stood up, inviting Amelia to accompany him. The four of them gathered in the living room, where the open windows let in the afternoon breeze and the scent of the flowers Leonor had planted years ago. Gabe, with the confidence he had gained after weeks of legal and media battles, spread some documents across the table. "This is what we've accomplished. The charges against Oliver have been formalized, and several of his allies have begun testifying against him. His assets are being frozen, and the investigations are revealing names we never would have imagined," he explained, his voice full of satisfaction. Ivy, who had worked tirelessly to help the victims still emerging from the scandal, added, "But we're not done. The networks of corruption extend beyond what we've seen, and we want to continue working to expose them and protect those who need it most." Blake nodded, understanding that this was a turning point. "If there's anything I can do, let me know. The company needs to change, and I want it to be a symbol of integrity and justice, not just power and success," he said with conviction. Amelia, hearing this, understood that her life too needed to take a new direction. She had survived, and now she needed to move forward, for herself and for Stella. Ivy, with a smile reflecting her enthusiasm for the future, proposed, "Gabe and I have been thinking of forming an organization dedicated to helping victims of fraud and corruption. Something bigger than just a support group. A foundation that offers legal resources, protection, and a space for stories like Amelia's to be heard." Amelia's eyes lit up. The idea of helping others who had gone through what she had filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. "I want to help. I know what it's like to lose everything and live in fear. I want to be part of this," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Blake, seeing the determination in her eyes, knew he had made the right decision in surrounding himself with people who shared a common goal. Armstrong and Sear will support the creation of that foundation, not just with resources, but with a real commitment to change, he promised, extending his hand to Gabe and Ivy. The afternoon passed with discussions on plans and strategies, but the atmosphere in the room had lightened. The faces, once marked by worry, now showed the spark of hope and the energy of a new beginning. At Nick's independent magazine office, The journalist reviewed the comments and emails from readers who felt inspired and motivated by the bravery of those who had exposed the corruption in the city. Threats still came in, but now they were accompanied by messages of support, reminding him why he had chosen this path. The truth may be harsh, but when it's told, it becomes the most powerful force, he thought, with a smile that reflected his satisfaction. That night, Blake's mansion was filled with laughter and voices. Nora prepared a simple but warm dinner, and for the first time in a long while, the dining table was occupied by people united by a shared purpose and a history of struggle. Stella ran around among the adults, her laughter lighting up the room, while Amelia and Blake exchanged glances that spoke of new alliances and a future where there was no place for fear, only for reconstruction and love. Gabe and Ivy left late, promising to begin the paperwork for the foundation the next day. Nick said goodbye with a gesture of gratitude and a line filled with humor. "If anyone dares to write our story, make sure they don't leave out the movie twists." When the house fell silent and the lights turned off one by one, Blake headed to the garden, where Leonor's flowers still bloomed under the moonlight. With his wife's letter in hand, he read it once more and felt that after so much time, he had fulfilled her wish. The promise to care for the light, to love even in the darkest moments, had become the cornerstone of a new life. Amelia watched him from the window and understood that, though the road had been long and painful, she had arrived at a place where second chances were not only possible, but real. A place where justice and redemption met, and where, finally, both she and Blake and all those around them could begin to build something that transcended fear and loss. Time had passed slowly since Oliver's fall and the unraveling of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed the lives of Blake, Amelia, and everyone involved in the corruption network. However, in every corner of the Majestic, the effects of that battle were felt like a whisper in the wind. The city, once dominated by secrets and shadows, was beginning to fill with a tangible hope, a hope nurtured by the sacrifice and courage of those who dared to confront power. At the Armstrong mansion, now bathed in soft, welcoming light, life had changed irreversibly. Amelia and Stella, who had found refuge in the house, were not only staying there, but had become a family to Blake. Nora, who had once been the solitary protector of the house's secrets and memories, now walked through it with a renewed smile. The hallways, once cold and silent, now echoed with laughter, conversations, and the music of a shared life. That morning, Blake was in the garden, planting flowers with Stella. The little girl, with sweat on her brow and dirt on her hands, laughed as she tried to follow Blake's instructions, who watched her with a look of tenderness and pride. "Leonor always wanted to fill this garden with flowers," Blake said, gazing toward the horizon. "I believe in some way her dream is finally coming true." Stella, not fully understanding, looked at him and smiled, nodding as if she understood the importance of his words. Amelia, from the terrace, watched them with a peaceful and grateful expression. She knew her life had changed in a way she never would have imagined, and that after the storm, she had found a home in a place she never thought would be possible. The house was not just a refuge, it was the place where she and her daughter were healing, where they could dream again, and perhaps build a new life. In the center of the Majestic, the inauguration of the foundation proposed by Ivy and Gabe was about to take place. Armstrong and Sia had contributed not only funds, but also the commitment to provide resources and services to those, like Amelia, who had been victims of corruption and abuse of power. The building, modest yet bright, was located in a central neighborhood, surrounded by parks and streets that reflected the pulse of the city. On its facade, the name of the foundation echoed as a promise, Fundación Leonor, in honor of the woman who had inspired the change they all now defended. Ivy and Gabe moved among the guests, ensuring that every detail was in order for the official opening. Nick, who had documented the entire process, was taking photos and talking with journalists who were curious to learn about the story behind the foundation. His magazine had become a respected voice, and this was its first major coverage since the scandal. Blake, Amelia, Nora, and Stella arrived shortly after. Upon crossing the door, they felt the weight and significance of that moment, a symbol of justice and the new direction their lives had taken. Blake's gaze filled with emotion as he saw Leonor's name at the entrance. His wife, in some way, had returned to him, and her dream of doing good for those who needed it most was now a reality. The ceremony began with a speech by Ivy, who spoke about the importance of creating safe spaces for those who, like Amelia, had been silenced and left to fend for themselves. With a firm and eloquent voice, Ivy narrated how corruption and greed had affected so many families, and how this foundation was not only a place of help, but a platform for injustice stories to be heard and addressed. This foundation represents the strength of those who, despite adversities, don't give up. This is a place where voices will be heard, and where justice will find its way, she concluded, receiving applause from the attendees. Gabe spoke next, thanking Armstrong and Sia, and all the people who, despite the fear, had come together to make this moment possible. It's not easy to face power, and sometimes the truth can be a burden. But when we choose to tell it, when we choose to confront the darkness, the light that emerges is capable of transforming everything it touches, he said, looking at Blake and Amelia with gratitude and respect. When it was Blake's turn, he stepped up to the podium with a calm that came from facing his own demons and knowing he was surrounded by people who shared his purpose. This foundation is more than just a project. It is the culmination of a promise that the truth will always find its way. I'm here thanks to those who believed in the power of justice and compassion. Today, the Majestic begins a new chapter, one that honors those who sacrificed everything to defend what is right, he concluded, with slightly misty eyes as he remembered Leonor. Amelia, standing among the crowd, watched the scene with a mixture of pride and emotion. She looked at Stella, who clung to her hand, and felt that they had finally found a place where they could be at peace. When the ceremony ended, Amelia approached Ivy and Gabe, thanking them for fighting for her and for Stella. "Without you, we wouldn't be here. You've given me my life back," she said, and embraced each of them with gratitude. As the guests began to disperse, Nick approached Blake and extended his hand. "I think you've done something truly great here. Leonor would be proud," he said with a sincere smile. Blake nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had taken on, and at the same time, the relief of knowing his life had found a new meaning. That evening, everyone returned to the mansion for an intimate celebration. Nora had prepared a special dinner, and the table, decorated with fresh flowers, was filled with laughter and conversations about the future. Gabe and Ivy, now a couple united by both work and love, talked about the plans for the foundation's expansion. Nick shared funny anecdotes from his investigations, while Stella ran around among the adults, filling the room with contagious joy. Amelia looked at Blake and approached him with a glass of wine in her hand. "Sometimes, I still can't believe we're here, all together," she said in a whisper, her gaze reflecting the disbelief and hope of having found a home and a family in the least expected place. Blake looked at her and nodded. "Destiny is curious. It takes us down paths we never imagined, but in the end, it always finds a way to lead us where we're meant to be," he replied, raising his glass in a silent toast. They both smiled, knowing that this was just one of the first pages in the story they were building together. The evening went on, and gradually the guests left, leaving the mansion in the serenity of the early morning. Blake, before resting, headed to the garden, where the flowers he and Stella had planted that morning shone under the moonlight. There, in the silence of the night, he felt Leonor's presence, like a warm whisper in the wind, and understood that her love and legacy would live on in every act of justice, in every smile, and in every flower that adorned that place. Finally, the Majestic had something it had never experienced before, a peace that was not fleeting, a peace built on truth, redemption, and love. The story of Blake, Amelia, Stella, and the other characters from the Majestic is a tale that resonates deeply with the nature of human suffering, redemption, and the struggle for justice. Throughout the narrative, we see how life often confronts us with challenges that seem impossible to overcome, and how, in those moments, the decisions we make can define not only our future, but also the future of those around us. One of the most powerful reflections that emerges from this story is the transformative power of truth and the importance of having the courage to face it, even when doing so means exposing our own vulnerabilities. Blake, a man who initially sought refuge in solitude and coldness after Leonor's death, shows that while pain may leave its mark, it doesn't have to define us forever. Love, in its various forms, is a driving force that pushes people to do extraordinary things, and in his case, it was little Stella and the memory of his wife that led him to find a new purpose beyond the walls of his mansion. Stella's arrival in Blake's life is a reminder that sometimes second chances don't come in the way we expect. The girl symbolizes innocence and hope, and although she arrives amidst loss and suffering, her presence begins to soften the harsh edges Blake had developed as a form of protection. In the process of caring for her, Blake is forced to look beyond his own sadness and to recognize that protecting someone else might be the key to healing his own wounds. Amelia, on the other hand, represents resilience and sacrifice. Her journey is a testament to what a mother is capable of doing out of love for her daughter, and how, even in the most desperate circumstances, faith and determination can be enough to keep going. She personifies the fight of the unprotected, those who are victims of corruption and the greed of others, and shows that, although justice may be delayed, the desire to protect what is most important can push people to resist any adversity. The alliance between Blake, Amelia, Ivy, Gabe, and Nick underscores the importance of solidarity and cooperation. Each of them brings something unique: the strength of experience, the drive of youth, the passion for truth, and the commitment to justice. Together, they achieve what none of them could have done alone, and that is a powerful reminder that unity is crucial in the fight against the forces that seek to exploit and harm the most vulnerable. Cyrus and Oliver, the antagonists, represent the shadows of greed and limitless power. Their downfall is a message that, although corrupt structures may seem invincible, there is always a crack through which light can penetrate. The characters in the story discover that true strength does not lie in control or wealth, but in integrity and the willingness to do what is right, even when that means risking everything. Finally, the creation of the Fundación Leonor symbolizes the legacy of past struggles and the promise of a better future. It is a concrete manifestation of how pain can turn into action and something that benefits others. The name of Leonor, Blake's wife, is not only immortalized on a plaque, but in every life the foundation touches and changes. This gesture encapsulates the idea that love and dreams can transcend death, and what we leave in the hearts of others is what truly endures. The story also invites us to reflect on the importance of not closing the door to change. Blake, at first, was locked in a prison of his own pain, but Stella's arrival and the support of people like Nora and Amelia helped him rediscover the humanity he had lost. This teaches us that it is never too late to transform our lives and make decisions that lead us to be more compassionate and committed to those around us. Ultimately, this story is a reminder that life is full of unexpected twists and that acts of bravery and love can create ripples of change that reach much farther than we could imagine. The challenge is to have the courage to take the first step, to trust that, despite the difficulties, there is always a way to build a new dawn. And when that is achieved, the reward is more than survival. It is the true realization of who we are and who we can become. And so we conclude this episode where we explored a story that reminds us that the fight for truth, justice, and love can transform even the hardest hearts and the darkest situations. If you've been inspired by the story of Blake, Amelia, and Stella and believe in the power of redemption and hope, I invite you to leave a comment about which moment impacted you the most and how you relate it to your own life. Don't forget to give us a like if you enjoyed the content, and subscribe for more stories that invite us to reflect on the great challenges and rewards we find in life. Remember, on our channel, we always aim to illuminate the darkness with stories of struggle and triumph. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, where we'll continue sharing stories that inspire and teach. Take care, and never forget that even in the most difficult moments, truth and love always find their way. See you in the next chapter.